All right, we're taping this. It is 1:30 Pacific time. Bryan Curtis from the Ringer is here. Derek Thompson from the Atlantic is here. Both of them have been on this podcast a couple times over the last few months. This NBA vaccine story, I was totally fascinated by yesterday, and how NBA Media Day, which is normally one of the dumbest days of the year, everybody pretends they love their new team, they love their new coach, they're totally happy they didn't ask for a trade, usually all basketball-related stuff, and somehow became this weird proxy of what's happening in America, and all the stuff that came out of it was vaccine related. Derek, I asked you to go read up on it and just kind of learn what happened yesterday to today, what the league is going to be dealing with going forward, because I think it's going to be the dominant issue this year. What was your big takeaway reading all this stuff?
Well, if you're grading the NBA relative to the rest of America, you would give it an A minus. Like, the vaccination rate of the NBA is much higher than the vaccination rate of the United States writ large. But the NBA is trying to reach 100%, and it is, at this point, it looks like it's probably not going to get there. You have a lot of really loud, outspoken holdouts. It's a very vocal minority with Kyrie Irving, Jonathan Isaac. And, what really gets me about the reasons that they give, you always hear about this issue of personal choice and privacy. And in the big picture, I have a lot of sympathy for personal choice and privacy. I want people to have privacy in their lives, and I'm here for the argument that our athletes deserve more privacy than they're given. But, it's just ironic, I think, with regard to athletes in this respect, because, these are people whose birthdays we know, whose heights we know, whose injuries history we know. We read profiles about their relationship with their mother. We know when they get sick. We know when they have an injury or a surgery. We know the doctor who performed those surgeries. We know all of those private details, and none of those details have anything to do with the contagion. It's impossible to catch a meniscus tear from a friend. It's impossible to have indoor transmission of ACL sprains. So I feel like people like Kyrie in particular are drawing the line of privacy at the very place where our individual decisions stop being fully private and start having these very dramatic public consequences. And yet you hear over and over again, it's a private decision. I would like someone to respond to them if they have the ability to in that press room. It might feel private to you, but it doesn't feel private to your family. It doesn't feel private to your trainer who is immunocompromised. It doesn't feel private to your coach who has a son who has asthma. It is the nature of pandemics to unprivatize our personal decisions and connect us in this web of contagion. And that is the issue that I think keeps getting missed.
Bryan, how do you cover this? What if you're like the beat reporter of Team X? How do you even handle this? And what happens if you're a beat reporter for Team X or a columnist or a local radio host, and you've been on Twitter or on your show or in your columns excoriating people for not getting vaccinated, and now this is somebody you have to cover for a living?
First of all, I'll second your thought that this was the most interesting NBA Media Day ever. Having gone to the Lakers one a couple years ago, and I saw a well-known basketball reporter high-fiving the Lakers players, and I'm, where am I? What is happening here? So at least it had a little drama, plus David Letterman, right, standing up and asking questions to KD. No, yep. To me, I'll tell you what I would cover about this, and I think is actually just as interesting as Kyrie and the players who have opted out, is talking to Kevin Durant and talking to Steph Curry in Golden State and saying, how do you handle this? Because we're always so fascinated by the dynamics within a team. And listening to the very careful way that KD was talking about this yesterday and Steph was talking about this yesterday really reminded me of very personal conversations within my own family, where you're like, I love you, relative. I really love you. I really want you to be at this important event. But it's also really important to me that you need to be vaccinated. And it's important to my kids and to other people in the family. And those are incredibly tough, tricky conversations to have. You want to have them the right way. And the way I heard those guys measuring their words, I'm like, oh, wow, this is a really high profile version of the exact same conversation.
Well, and you're talking about leadership of players, leadership of coaches, leadership of a front office, the owners. There's this whole infrastructure in place to kind of nudge people to adhere to the quote unquote team. And in football, you have 53 players. It's a little easier if you have a couple people that maybe aren't following the herd. But in this case, 15 players per team. if one of the stars of a team is just basically out for all the home games, that's a massive disadvantage. So you have that. You also have somebody like you mentioned, Durant, really competitive, wants to win a title, is the best player in a team, came to Brooklyn, built this whole thing. Now it's being endangered by this other teammate that he has that he brought with him. So, hey, Derek, I think one of the fascinating things for me is the NBA for 75 years, we're hitting our 75th year with this league, over and over again, has been able to reflect whatever is going on in America in a really unique way to the league. You know, and I grew up baseball as the American pastime. In a lot of ways, it feels like the NBA has become more of America's pastime in that it reflects America. During George Floyd and everything that happened last summer, the NBA was the crucial league for that, right? When you go back to player empowerment, when you go back to hip hop culture and how hip hop culture was becoming the dominant pop culture in the 90s, and it was reflected through the NBA. You go back to Bill Russell in the 60s, and he's on the front line with Ali and civil rights and all this stuff. Over and over again, the NBA is there. And is it weird to think that the NBA is now at the forefront of this because of the profiles of the stars that they have?
I think that's exactly what it is. I think it's about the profiles of the stars that they have. You could say that in a way, this is the flip side of player empowerment. On the one hand, what does player empowerment give you? It allows individual players' voices on issues like social justice, Black Lives Matter, to be amplified. But it also means that the voices of Kyrie Irving and Jonathan Isaac are also amplified. And so we're now hearing in very public ways, reasons for not accepting this vaccine, which in some cases among sort of, family members or friends of ours that don't necessarily want to talk about their decisions, those decisions or that rationality might be hidden from us. Well, now it's not hidden from us at all because of player empowerment. You have them talking to the media and saying, I'm not going to take this vaccine. I'm not going to tell you why, because I think this is an entirely private decision. I really think that this is the flip side of the coin of player empowerment. If you give people the ability, I think, to essentially have their opinions be broadcast really, really loudly across the country to reflect the ethos and the zeitgeist of the country, you're going to get the good with the bad. You're going to get Black Lives Matter. You're going to get social justice. You're going to get people talking about systemic racism. You're also going to get vaccine hesitancy. You're just going to get all of it.
Bryan, did it feel like the NBA kind of wasn't prepared for this, that it didn't see it coming? Because they came out today. They did today what I thought they were going to do before Media Day, which is basically to call out the Players Association and say, hey, we wanted everyone vaccinated. The Players Association, they pushed back. The NBA they wouldn't play ball in it, and that's it. And that's where we are. I can't help but think what would happen if David Stern was the commissioner. Now, first of all, Stern would have loved this. This would have been, his way of he would have taken center stage. He would have turned this into big theater. But I also think he would have been really hard about this stuff. And I think he would have said, hey, if you're not vaccinated, you're not getting paid, period. That's like, I don't care if we come to a deal with the association or not. And he probably would have made this worse. Adam Silver seems like he is being more careful and more inclusive, but it also didn't solve anything. And now we're at this point where the season's going to start in 3.5 weeks, and it doesn't seem like anyone has any idea how this is going to play out. I feel like they should have a better idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like they ran into the union issue. We have to collectively bargain this. We couldn't get anywhere with that, so we stopped. And then I think if you're the league, you're probably thinking, what if social pressure on teams solved this problem for us? Because we saw this right when baseball came back last summer, early on in the pandemic, and a lot of baseball players, right, are saying, hey, don't go out tonight because we need you to come back to the hotel room and do nothing so that we can be healthy and we'll have all of our players available. And it solved some problems. It didn't solve all problems. Then we got to football season, and I think social pressure within these teams has convinced some players to get vaccinated, but it hasn't convinced everybody to get vaccinated. And I think it feels like the NBA is saying, we've done what we can bargaining wise. Now we're going to hope that there can be this person-to-person conversation saying, hey, you may not want to do this, but we need you. From a basketball point of view, we need you to be available to play. So far, and that's about how far they got.
Well, the NFL went a lot further. And Derek, the last time you came on, we talked about that. The NFL, not surprising. Goodell, who I'm not a fan of at all, but he was a hard ass about it. He's like, hey, if you have outbreaks, you're going to forfeit games. You're going to lose paychecks. Here are all the bad things that are happening. Adam Silver has not operated that way. And that's why he's been a more popular commissioner, I think, than Roger Goodell is. At the same time, it kind of feels like this situation, the Roger Goodell strategy of, I do not care about the players. This is a business. We're going to protect our business at all costs. The NBA is a business. And if they have guys that just aren't going to get vaccinated, and you also have a very, very player-friendly commissioner, where does that leave us, Derek?
So yeah, if it's not going to be mandated, if it's not going to be like, say, Duke University, University of Florida, the places where, Kyrie and Brad Beal came from, they mandate immunizations. They mandate immunizations for Hep B and, diphtheria and tetanus. The NBA can't do that in large part because of its union. So you lose the ability to mandate, and you don't have essentially a Caesarean commissioner like Roger Goodell, who's basically going to say, I don't care what decisions you make, I'm going to force you to get vaccinated without actually having a mandate, because it's going to be so easy to essentially require you to forfeit the game in case there are outbreaks on the team. Without that, all you have, I think, is what Bryan said. You have social pressure. That's basically it. You have social pressure from within the team, and then you have local policy. So local policy is a huge deal for the Brooklyn Nets, because I don't believe that Kyrie Irving legally has the ability to, walk into Barclays Center. I don't think he can enter the building. So I don't know how he's going to file for any kind of exemption to be able to play home games. And obviously the Nets are not going to be thrilled about having a star player on their team who can't play in half of their games. So to me, I only see two avenues here. Social pressure from within the team, from within essentially the corporate family that is a team, that the same conversations that millions of families have had between the cousins and the nephews and the fathers and the children. Please get vaccinated for the family. Please think about the broader community. You're going to have that. And then you're also going to have the additional pressure in some cities that have made it mandatory for people to walk into the building to have a vaccination card.
I feel like Kyrie Irving is not going to play this season. And I don't say that in a first take kind of, here's my take coming up next. I'm going to give after having followed this guy for his career, having seen him in Boston for a couple of years, and just seen in general how he handles things, and he beats to his own drum, as we know. But I feel like he would sacrifice playing to be in control of what he should do with his body. I really think he's going to grab onto this and make it a thing, and that's going to ultimately mean he's not going to play. What was interesting, I thought Jonathan Isaac, whether you agreed or disagreed with him, I thought he was really eloquent with what he said, and he had put real thought into it. And I think that was the difference between what he said and what Bradley Beal said. Was Bradley Beal just seemed like he was that generic, I just don't understand vaccines kind of the way he laid it out, where it's just like, oh, you could still get COVID if you have the vaccine. It's like, yeah, but you're almost definitely not ending up at the hospital, and you're almost definitely not dying. That's the point of the vaccine. You might still get COVID, but with Isaac, it was interesting to hear him talk about, I mean, I've already had COVID. I had the antibodies. I'm in unbelievable shape. I'm a physical specimen, and I'm not worried about getting it. But yet he didn't understand the part, yeah, but you could still get it and give it to somebody else who's not in as good a shape as you. So it was really illuminating, Bryan, the just media day, like hearing all the same kind of misnomers about vaccinations and everything that we've been hearing for the last, 9 months? And now we got to hear it through some of our favorite basketball players.
I also loved how the GMs talked about it, because they all had kind of the same answer. We're expecting everyone to be available when the season started.
Or fully expect. That was another one. We fully expect. What does fully expect mean?
I saw Bob Myers of the Warriors. He's like, I don't want to talk about hypotheticals. And go, well, training camp is starting right now.
Yeah.
So we kind of passed the hypothetical stage, and now we're in the stage of actual basketball. So you kind of have to answer.
Well, there was some other ones like who admitted, like, yeah, I just got my first shot last week, and and it was clear, like, it was usually like somebody who maybe wasn't a starter, and it was clear that the best guy in the team or the coach or whoever was like, hey, you're getting the vaccine. You're doing this. This is not up for discussion anymore. How does this play out, Derek, in the sense of some of the stuff that comes up is stuff people have deep down been thinking about, right? Like you hear, especially if you go on any conspiracy board, what about all the bad reactions to the vaccines? You heard a couple players mention that yesterday. I know somebody who had a bad reaction. You hear that. You hear, well, how come if I get vaccinated, I still get COVID? The vaccine doesn't work. How do we educate people on the misnomers in a way that we obviously haven't done well in the last 9 months?
It's a really, really good question. It's really tough to answer, but I think I might have at least the beginning of an answer. So I was reading Jonathan Isaac's quote, and it really is a remarkable statement because he is 100% right about 90% of the vaccine. He says, I'm not anti-vax, I'm not anti-medicine, I'm not anti-science. Our understanding of antibodies, of natural immunity has changed a great deal. Taking the vaccine, it would decrease my chances of having a severe reaction, but it does open the, albeit rare, possibility of having an adverse reaction to the vaccine itself, end quote. That is 100% right. It just leaves out the final 10% of it reduces the likelihood that I will transmit this to vulnerable people. And what just occurred to me is, I'm a longtime listener of Bryan's podcast and his criticism and evaluation of post-game interviews. What is the most cliche post-game interview answer? Well, we're just a team. Well, we're just doing this as a team. Ironically, the most cliche answer is the final 10% that Jonathan Isaac needs in his answer. This is not an individual choice. Pandemics just smash the boundary between individuals. This is a collective choice. That cliche, terrible answer that you give at halftime, at the end of games to every reporter, well, I'm doing it for the team. We're all in this together. We act as a team. It's not about individual achievements. That is exactly the perspective that you need about the vaccines. It's not about your less severe reaction alone. It's about the decreased likelihood that you will pass it along to the broader team, your teammates, the assistant coaches, their families and friends, and the immunocompromised and elderly people that live amongst them. That's what it's about. And so what I would encourage people to do when they have conversations with people that do seem relatively educated at this point, like Jonathan Isaac is to just push them toward the sports cliche of the last 10%. It's not about the individual. It's about the team. And the team here is not just those who wear the jersey. It's those who support the people that wear the jersey and all the people that they go home to in their lives.
There were some good quotes about that yesterday or today. And Baxter Holmes wrote a story, and a lot of the people were unnamed in it. But basically, the trainer on Team X, that unidentified team, being like, hey, my grandparents or my parents live with us, and one of them is not in great shape, and I don't want to bring home the virus and kill him. And when you hear quotes like that, you're like, yeah, that would suck to work for a team, be in a work environment where you don't trust the people around you. And I think this isn't just a sports thing. This is a corporation thing. This is why the Ringer hasn't really been in an office in 18 months, basically. There's a different level of trust that goes into that stuff. The NFL has somehow been able to manage it, and it just seems like COVID now, in year 2 of this, has just become part of the injured list. It's like a pulled hamstring. Oh, COVID protocol, he's out.
Mm-hmm.
NBA is a much more naked sport, and we know these guys way better. There's less players on the team. I don't know. I honestly don't know where this goes, Bryan. I don't know what do the next 3 weeks look like? Walk us through it.
Well, if I'm sending out the NBA long form bat signal right now, it's going to be, what are the conversations like between players on teams? And it answers your original question of how do you get people the right information? The best and most convincing, conversation these people can have is going to be with Steph Curry or with Kevin Durant. And it may be that team ownership or the GM is calling Steph Curry. I'm sure they've already done it and said, hey, is there any way you can have this conversation? Because you're, coming from you, maybe it's more convincing than us. I really do want to know what those conversations are like. They're fascinating. Again, they do mirror the conversations that I think all of us have been having in one way or another. But that to me is what the immediate future is like. And, as we get close to the season, it'll become more interesting.
It happened with the Red Sox. Chris Sale is like the leader of the team by all accounts, at least from a pitching standpoint, and is the veteran and most important guy. Then missed some games with the COVID protocol thing, and then admitted he wasn't vaccinated. And this is a Red Sox team that had a really severe outbreak at the end of August, early September. And you're just watching this day to day. And it's like, oh, who's that shortstop? I've never seen that guy. Oh, that's Jose Iglesias. When did we get him? And it's because guys are just getting shuttled in and out because they have this COVID outbreak. And then you have the leader of the team who's not vaccinated. And we're in a pennant race. We're trying to get the wild card. And everybody's just kind of like, what the hell's going on? Derek, is it the non-vaccinated side, which some of the arguments are pretty ridiculous. My favorite is that the vaccine puts something in your arm that allows you to get tracked by Bill Gates but meanwhile somebody's tweeting that and they're on their iPhone, which is tracking you everywhere you go. Like maybe take a bigger look at what's tracking you. The one thing that I think is a pretty good argument is like our country's problems with dieting and just staying in shape in general, and especially during the pandemic, and how many people are out of shape, and the kind of foods that we make, and soda, and all these terrible things we do to our bodies. And then you hear the other side, like, why don't we care about that? Why do we care about this? And it's just opening up this can of worms of all these things we probably should be talking about, but I wish it was better circumstances. Does that make sense?
If the debate over the vaccines opens up a broader conversation about how to be healthy in America, that's a conversation that I welcome. But if the question is, how should we get vaccinated or should we not get vaccinated? What's the healthy choice there? The answer is easy. People should get vaccinated. And once we do, then the country can open up in a way that will make us healthier. So, for example, fewer people I can see going to my gym in Washington, D.C., precisely because masks are mandated, because there's been a little bit of an outbreak in Washington, D.C. There will be less of an outbreak as vaccinations increase and more people can go to the gym. I think the country will be healthier overall when more people make this decision. So I think that it's good if the way that we are debating health in the country is not the end of a conversation that stops with sort of hopefully the end of this pandemic, but a conversation that keeps going. That's fantastic. But I don't want to conflate that with the question of people not getting vaccinated. People should get vaccinated. That's the answer to the first question. And then after that, let's talk about how to make Americans healthier overall.
Yeah, I'm in the camp like booster shot, sure. Sounds great. And I was never like a flu vaccine guy. I never got the flu shot. I don't know if you guys were, but I just was like, nah, I'm good. I'll get the flu every year and be fine. This is a little different. I don't want to go to the hospital.
That's actually a great example. I was just talking to a friend about this. I have been a pretty sporadic flu vaccine getter, and I'm somewhat ashamed to say so, especially because I feel like, Bill, as I've talked to you, I've represented myself as extremely pro-vaccine, and of course I am. This experience will absolutely change the frequency with which I get the flu vaccine going forward. I'm going to get it every single year now. So maybe that's a very small, individual, subtle example of how the kind of conversations that we're having now about health will help us in the years forward.
Bryan, before we let Derek go, what sports media takes are you most excited for over these next 4 years? Where are the zags? Who's going to be zagging and doing it's Kyrie Irving's body and his choice? Like, what meat is on that bone?
So I have been waiting for that zag, actually. And, look, that take could be out there already. I haven't seen a ton of it yet because I think, it is interesting to just read the way sports media goes on all these kinds of things. And Derek's right that this is all running, smack dab into the player empowerment era. But I'm looking forward to an interesting, let us say, take on that. But I have not seen that yet. At least a big one.
It's quite a zag sitting there for somebody. Derek, it feels like every time you've come on, we've been at a different point of this whole vaccine thing. I don't remember, what was it, April, May range you came on and we were feeling so great. And now, I know people in my life who have had breakthrough cases, multiple people. They all, they got out of it, but it's just a little alarming that people are still getting it and having no idea how they got it. Oh, was it at my son's Little League game? Was that at, was it from the Uber driver who took me from point A to point B? Like, I was definitely more optimistic the last few times I've seen you on Zooms with when this is going to end.
Yeah, look, the first thing to say is that all pandemics end. Every pandemic has ended, and this one is going to end too. When it ends, hopefully in the next few months and not something that lasts several years, I definitely feel like Delta was a steroidal challenge. Like whatever COVID looked like in March, Delta was COVID on steroids. And the vaccines clearly have not held up on the infection side, as well as people were hoping they would hold up in March and April. But where they've held up really, really well is on the most important fronts. They've held up really well in severe illness, and they've held up really well on deaths. And that's why you see month after month that the line between unvaccinated deaths and vaccinated mortality continues to grow and grow and grow. So I don't think that the last few months have made the decision of get vaccinated or don't get vaccinated more complicated. If anything, I think it's simplified it because Delta has been so much more contagious that it's all the more deadly for people that aren't vaccinated. But absolutely, I wish that we were still in the April world where it looked like we would have finally beat this thing. We might just be, a year off. At some point, the combination of vaccinations, natural immunity, and unfortunately deaths will end this pandemic. And hopefully it is in the next few months.
This one's for both of you, and then Derek, you could go. Bryan, you take it first. Do you feel like the way the media has covered COVID and the COVID porn that we've basically had, where it's like I go on my Apple News and you see the 4 stories on the left, and one of them is always like, unvaccinated mom dies of COVID, or vaccinated mom has complications, or whatever, combined with the fact that we don't talk about hospitalizations and deaths as much as we talk about just COVID cases, where it seems like hospitalizations and deaths have dropped significantly. And it seems like the mainstream media should really be focusing on that and hammering it home because it's the best case to get the vaccine. But yet it's always about COVID cases, and it's always leaning toward, kind of these extreme examples or some crazy story, things like that. Just from a media coverage standpoint, are we doing a good enough job yet?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I feel I've tried to really avoid those kind of stories and listen to smart people like Derek and read smart people like Derek on this subject, because if there's ever been a subject where you pick 2 or 3 people and just went with them for the entirety of the pandemic and sort of probably collapsed your news reading into a handful of people, this has been one of them for me. I don't mean you shouldn't read widely and all that kind of stuff, but I've just tried to find people I like and I trust and read them and sort of shut out a lot of that noise.
I've done the same. Derek, what do you think?
I think that one of the pre-existing conditions of the media that has been exposed by this virus is the fact that sometimes when we're very confused, we have a very small number of hands to play. And one of them is the shame game. And you see that, I think, certainly I think you see it too much on the left, but also I think you see it too much on the right, that we can get to a point where rather than focus on evidence and report facts, we instead look to shame the other side and try to feel like we're getting one over our political enemy. And I wish, looking back, I wish there was less team picking in media. I guess I would put it that way. I feel like I came into this pandemic thinking like America was so polarized, but maybe something really dramatic might unite this country. And there's nothing more universalizing than a pandemic. It is everywhere. This is a global pulse that might be like the most universal international news story in the history of the world. Like even World War II wasn't as international as COVID. And yet rather than flatten polarization across the media landscape, it's heightened it. We came into it with like these goggles to see the world, which was always my side right, your side wrong. And rather than throw them away and try to solve problems, I feel like too much of the media has just held the goggles tight to their face and refused to see this crisis in any way that isn't hyper-political. So if I could have one overarching criticism of the coverage of this pandemic, it has been that we can't get out of our way in seeing the world exclusively through hyper-polarized lenses. And that's really, really bad for telling people the truth. Because on a first order basis, you're not telling people the truth. You're just telling people that their side is still virtuous and the other side is still wrong, just over and over and over again. And I wish we found some way to break out of it and find a way to report on this virus across the political landscape that was evidence first and ideology last.
So in 2024, you're saying President Caitlyn Jenner should destroy all social media coming out of the gate? Because, Bryan, I was thinking about this with all the 9/11 retrospective stuff earlier this month. And you think like that happens and it was honestly the most American moment of my lifetime. We were all on the same side with that, and we all embraced New York. And I was living in Boston at the time, and it I don't want to say patriotic, but there was like a patriotic element that sprung out of that, where it was like, hey, we got to rebuild New York. This can't happen to us, and you could feel it, and we were all in it together. And I was thinking, like, what if that had happened in 2021? How immediately it would have become this polarizing thing and people taking sides and trying to blame and pitting against each other. That was not what 9/11 was like. 9/11 was really weirdly communal. Did you notice that at all when you were watching that stuff?
It was interesting because one thing I read in all the retrospectives was there was this idea that, of course, in the immediate aftermath, there was a sense of pulling together and, coming together as one. But pretty quickly that dissolved, and it became one of these things where, everybody says, oh, wasn't that great? We all pulled together. And then you look back and say, actually, we didn't, and
so when did that change? That was like a couple months later or we're sooner than that?
I don't know. Derek may be able to pin down the date better than I can, but it was, I would say that it wasn't that long after. And then in fact, we did go in lots of different directions as a country. And we've not, this has led us to the path where we are now, or been a data point on the path to where we are now. So I don't know. I really don't.
Yeah, I guess Fox News definitely at some point started working it, but I don't know. I just feel like that those first few days, it felt like we were all involved in a way that I would have thought the pandemic would have triggered. You know what I mean? And it's just weird. It's just really, this has been a really weird 18 months.
I mean, it's probably worth pointing out, at least when, juxtaposing 9/11 and COVID, that after 9/11, George W. Bush, whom I wasn't a huge fan of and still not, visited the site of the crisis. He recognized the reality of the tragedy. Donald Trump did the opposite of recognize the reality of the tragedy. Unfortunately, he downplayed the virus as much as possible, said it'd be over by Easter, and brought in people who were chosen, unfortunately, specifically because he saw in them the ability to continue to downplay how serious COVID would potentially be. So I'm not a great man of history theorist. I don't think everything just flows from whatever the president says. At the same time, I think that certainly one of the differences between that crisis and this one was the leadership that we had. And that leadership was also was partly reflected in the fact that sort of there were institutional ways that we sort of knew how to respond to a terrorist attack, both in New York and with our defense. That's not a defense of the wars that came after, but there was clearly an apparatus in place to attack the forces that attacked us. In COVID, we did not have that counterforce. We did not know how to attack the forces that attacked us. We had rampant failures from the FDA and the CDC and the White House. We were not institutionally prepared for this pandemic at all. And I think that also created a vacuum of uncertainty, kind of fog of pandemic, into which partisan and polarized voices flowed. And that, I think, was a huge part of why there wasn't any kind of unified sense of what this risk was. Because our leadership, our institutions, and the White House didn't provide a clear evidence-based sense of what the threat actually was.
Well, now we get to relive those months on the morning show with Jennifer Aniston and Reese Witherspoon as season 2 revolves around the COVID response. Derek, we will continue to read you on The Atlantic. Thanks for popping on and talking about this with us.